Well, we're wired to feel intense empathy for individuals who are close to us, and we can be told stories in a manner that makes that system manifest itself. And everyone and their dog thinks that that's a wonderful thing, and we call that empathy, right? And empathy has a narrow domain of utility, as it turns out, because maybe if you were all who you should be, you'd be weeping constantly for the catastrophic fate of sentient beings on the earth, but you can't handle it, you know what I mean? It's that you can barely handle your own suffering, and maybe you can handle a bit of the suffering of your family, and more power to you if you could rectify that, and if you were better human beings, maybe you could expand that outwards. But the fact that our empathy doesn't scale up to the level of genocide with the same intensity that we treat instances of individual suffering isn't an indication that we're irrational. It's just an indication that we're limited.
Well,
now,
it's actually not right.
That's not true. I think this is an indication of exactly the problem of our evolved structures not matching the present. Because the point is...
Well, they do match because we take care of our families.
No, but they don't match because if you encountered the starving girl, that's some sort of it's a crude measure of suffering in your local environment. Were you in the past? Now that you can encounter this girl on the television, it's not clear what it should mean to you.
Right.
Right? You can't calibrate
it might
how
mean
many...
get your act together.
Right, and so the point is, your indifference to a genocide, which is an abstraction, right, is altered should you see pictures of the bodies, for example. You shouldn't actually feel differently about the genocide in the abstract case versus the case that you're looking at the bodies. And the fact that we have access to photorealistic representations of these things is...
No, but it's worse than that. This is why it's actually irrational, because I can show you the case where you care at level 10 about the little girl named Leela, and you care at level 8 about the little girl named Leela and her brother named Janti, right? And you care at level 4 if I've added a few more kids, but the little girl named Leela, who you ostensibly care about, is there in each one of these, right? So it is irrational.
Yeah, but your resources are diminished.
No, but like
you have multiplication of the suffering.
You have $10 to give away every month to help struggling humanity, and you tell me you'll give 10 to Leela this month, and then I catch you in another moment, and I say, well, you know, it's Leela and her brother, so it's like if you only can give 10. I understand, but you know, the problem is actually worse than I suspected. And you say, well, actually, I'm just going to give 8, right? It's not coherent with how much you cared about Leela in the first place.
We do know quite well that the heuristics that we use to orient ourselves in the world can be placed into frameworks where they produce contradictory outcomes. But that doesn't mean that the heuristics themselves are deeply flawed. It's a problem with the work of people like Kahneman and Tversky.
Yeah,
is they take perfectly valid heuristics.
We need to correct for them because they're producing a reliable result that we recognize.
Yeah, but no, you can put them in a situation where they produce a counterproductive response, but that doesn't mean that generally speaking in most situations they don't produce a useful outcome, because the question is, why in the hell would have they evolved if they didn't produce a useful outcome most of the time?
They evolved to live with 150 people with whom we're related and to be terrified of the people in the next valley who may want to kill and eat us.
Yes,
right?
and
that's our ancient circumstance,
right,
which doesn't map onto a common humanity of 7 billion people trying to figure out how to get to Mars without killing each other.
Well, it does map onto it sometimes, unfortunately, because there are many times when we still face the same kind of threats. In fact, it maps onto
this is the hierarchy that we're trying to climb
Sam.
here.
You wouldn't be concerned about the fundamentalist terror of Islam if you weren't driven by those essentially tribal considerations.
No,
and I'm not suggesting that it's wrong.
It doesn't require, a mere identification with humanity, it can ground not wanting to be murdered by people who are identified with a subset of humanity, right? Like I don't need to be part of a smaller tribe to care that people will murder me over burning a Quran, right? It's clearly counterproductive that we live in a society where some objects are held with such totemic attachment for irrational reasons by many, many millions of people, where that you should be sympathetic with this. Our free speech is actually canceled on this point, right?
Yes.
You literally can't produce cartoons.
Look,
there are scholarly works
look,
about the cartoon crisis that don't show the cartoons.
We have no argument whatsoever
So
between us about the lack of utility of certain
you don't have to be
totalitarian
identified
presuppositions.
as a Christian or a Jew to push back against that. You just have to be a human being that sees the dysfunction of a smaller kind of provincialism.
Well, the thing that I'm struggling with is that I still can't understand in what your ethos is grounded. Because you claim like a transcendental rationalism, but you won't identify the structures that produce it. It's a black box. And when I try to push you on the absolute nature of your ethical claim, which is that the bad life is worse than the good life, and that we should, in fact, universally work towards the good life, it doesn't seem to me that you'll accept the proposition that that's a universal claim.
No, it is. Well, should is irrelevant here. It's just the fact that there is the possibility of moving in this space. If you move in the wrong direction, if you move far enough, you'll like it less and less.
Well, why is should irrelevant?
Given the minds you have,
Well,
right?
Well, I thought
what
that
if you
should
had
would-
to, what if you had to accept moving in the wrong direction and experiencing less and less well-being in order
to get to a better place.
Maybe even just to survive. Suppose a population has to endure a generation and a half of misery in order to persist for another 100
Ethically,
years.
that's a perfectly intelligible circumstance that people have had to face, and it's on my moral landscape, it's analogous to, I mean, we might be at one local maximum or some high point, but we're moving down a slope to get to yet some higher place, right? So some things may only be possible if we made some painful and net unpleasant sacrifice to get there.
That's for sure.
Yes, and so that can be rationally apprehended. There can be an argument for that. It could be we all have to go on a diet, otherwise we're going to die of this problem, right? We all have to stop eating whatever it is, wheat, right? It's a hard sacrifice for people who have to stop it, as you know. If that were just true, well, then there'd be an argument for it. There'd be evidence that would convince us. We would stop. We would feel the pain, and we would get whatever benefit that was on the other side of that sacrifice. But again, you don't have to. It's the utility. Again, to bring it back to stories, which is, as you know, not my emphasis, but it is yours. The utility of stories is not something I'm arguing against. I mean, there's no question that certain stories are incredibly compelling, and in our conversation with one another, the moment you begin to frame something in terms of a story, people become much more interested, right? Like if 90% of what we said together tonight were framed, each point we were making as a matter of philosophy or science were framed in, well, actually, yesterday I was walking down the street and I met this guy, who's a terrifying looking guy, and all of a sudden people become much more interested, right? And then that's not an accident. And that says something deep about us that we could understand in evolutionary terms, and we might in fact want to creatively leverage to be better people and to have better conversations.
Definitely.
Yes. So
that's what I think.
There's nothing that I say in opposition to religious dogmatism and religious sectarianism that discounts that reality. And that's a psychological reality. It's a cultural reality, and I'm not against making the most of it. My basic claim, however, is that we never need to believe that one of our books may not have a human origin in order to do that effectively. You can be just as compelled by the example of somebody like Jesus or some more modern person who strikes you as a moral hero and deeply wise, without believing anything on insufficient evidence. And as you alluded to, purely fictional stories about superheroes can have immense effect on us. And that's something we could understand and also leverage. But again, that takes us out of the religion business, and that's all I've been arguing for.